Thank you, Yaakov Malkin, for a very provocative and deep analysis. And I would like to turn to the panel to try to react.
All right.
Sure.
Yaakov, you made a distinction between historical truth and poetic truth. I think what you meant to say was there's truth and there are different ways to express it. One is through prose and one is through poetry. Or you may mean that there are truths that are specific to a time and there are truths that are philosophic. And then you said the Genesis was, like Hamlet, poetically true, eternally true. Well, one can't deal with Genesis as a whole. One has to deal with Genesis as a series of stories. So let me just ask you, like, a question. You know, one of the stories that everybody teaches the kids is the story of Noah, which has a dreadful moral to it. You see, if it's a poetic truth, then obviously it's attached in some way to a moral message about the human condition or responding to the human condition. So there are all these people who aren't doing right, and Yahweh's answer to it is to drown everybody. And Noah doesn't protest. Noah never says to Yahweh, "What?" And Woody Allen did that, at least with the Akeda. But what are you doing? I mean, it's outrageous. It's terrible. How dare you? Instead, Noah just collects 2x2s or whatever, 7x7s, and into the ark. And then I remember hearing that story, and I don't know what moral to extract from, what poetic truth to extract from it. That is, there are some stories from which you can extract valid truth. A poetic truth means that the value embedded in it has validity. The other thing is that Pesach story with the firstborn. I mean, there is this wonderful deity who is obviously in charge of life and death. And the 10th plague, it's a wonderful story to tell children. The 10th plague is that Yahweh, and I don't think I'm as fond of, I think we're both as fond of Yahweh as, equally, but there is Yahweh, and he decides to exterminate all the firstborn of Egypt. And I remember listening to the story, and then we all applaud at the Seder. And then the Jews passed through the Red Sea and all of that. And so what I want to know is, what is the poetic... See, what you can do, and I understand that, there are certain stories in what we call traditional literature, either biblical or rabbinic literature or Kabbalistic literature, that have very nice morals. But there are lots of stories, and what you call myths. By the way, the word myth in Greek simply is a story, the central figure of which is a god, whether true or false. But obviously there are, you just can't go to Jewish literature, to all the mythology, and say, well, like Hamlet, it's all beautiful. Some of it's okay, and some of it may be beautiful, but some of it may be rotten. So I want you to respond to that.
I think that amazingly, Sherwin is protesting like a religious man. He would like poetic truth to be identical with the moral message. Poetic truth has nothing to do with moral message. Poetic truth has sometimes to do with uncovering, discovering the terrible tragedies in life that have nothing to do with morality or are anti-moral. I think that Yahweh, as a literary hero, God as a literary hero in the Bible, in most cases, is not a moral figure. And what we see that he does to people, like in the Mabul story, like in the deluge story, is immoral, like he did in Sodom. So poetic truth is the uncovering of an inner soul truth, emotional truth, the truth of a human being facing a tragedy, and not the conclusion, the moral conclusion, which will fit our belief or our moral statement. Therefore, I think that the stories, and of course you're right, when I say Genesis, I meant stories in Genesis. There are stories in Genesis that have chapters in Genesis that have nothing to do with poetry or with poetic truth, of course. But I'm speaking about those stories who do. And then you can see how they can live in this process of mythization and demythization. I'll just give you one example. We are a secular family. I think some people here know that I'm a traditional Jew, I'm an atheist, my father was an atheist, my grandfather was an atheist. And we are really a traditional family. And in our family, when holidays come, we are always looking for a way how to celebrate in our way according to our faith and belief. And one holiday, I don't know what to do with it, and this is Yom Kippur. Because this is a holiday that has no historical value, has, in my eyes, no other value except for a religious value for religious people. And this year, we were together with our children and grandchildren, and suddenly they say there is a way of celebrating Yom Kippur by making a play of Jonah. Here is a story which became a myth, the story of Jonah, with a moral conclusion, because their God, in an exceptional case, is right. And they read the story, a girl of 13, and a girl of 10, and a little child of 3.5. They worked together, and they made an inscenization. They wrote a screenplay, and they made a play in modern Hebrew of the story of Jonah that they read. And in this story, when Jonah says, well, how dare you not to fulfill your promise of destroying Nineveh, the children said, he is right. But when God says to him, how can you say such a thing? You are angry at me because of this bush that saved you from the heat of the sun, a bush that you didn't do anything to make it grow, and in one day it grew, and one day it withered. And I shall not have mercy on a city with 120,000 people who don't know to discern between right and left, and all these animals? And the children said, he is right. This is poetic truth. Poetic truth is not a moral conclusion. Poetic truth is a discovery of dilemmas and contradictions in our life, of all the anger that we have against Berlin and the wish we had that it should be destroyed like Nineveh should have been destroyed, and the realization that we cannot destroy Berlin because there are 120,000 people there who do not know the right from the left.
But the myth has a message of how to respond. And that is, in the Jonah story, the correct way to respond that the child can pick up is indeed not to destroy, but to rescue. But the message in the Noah story, I mean, if you want to, you can turn myths upside down. But that isn't how people read them. If you want to say God is the villain, the way the story is told, God isn't the villain. God is the hero, and he explains your suffering to you. In the Noah story, the reason why we suffer is because we have sinned. And in the Egyptian story, the reason why we have suffered is because we have sinned. And in the way the book of Job is ultimately completed, the reason why Job suffered is because God tests us, and we should...
That's not true. That's not what's written there. No, I mean, this is, again, not reading plain Hebrew. What's written in Job, in the epilogue...
No, but let's go back to Noah.
God is an amoral...
No.
It's written that God says, I am the cosmos, and the cosmos and nature cannot be moral or not moral. I am amoral. There's nothing to do with your sins and your punishment. It's not my business. My business is to conduct the cosmos, the universe, to create. This is my thing. You have your world.
Job's response at the end, God's response at the end is...
in the Noah story,
yes.
God regrets the terrible things he did to the world and makes his beautiful promise, as we know, the rainbow. And the story, in the end, the main poetic truth is that no matter how you are saved, you can always sin sexual sins like Noah did when he was drunk immediately after he was saved from the deluge. Nothing to do with trying things or with becoming right or wrong.
I mean, in the case of Job, the answer of God is, who the hell do you think you are to ask the question? He asserts his authority. Parents do it in desperation. So, right. But again, I want to point out, and I respect the way you want to treat the literature, but I think there's a great danger. There are two dangers. One danger is that we never teach history, but only teach literature.
Why not? Teach both?
That we never get to the history, we only teach the stories. And the second thing, which is very important, is that because we are so eager to defend the past, we sometimes make broad statements. It is certainly true that there are many stories in Jewish literature in the past that have what I would call an ethical value or enable us to deal with the issues of life. If indeed in the Noah story a flood came, and in fact it was an unjust flood, and people looked at it and said, we're going to go on despite it, then that would have what I would call a humanistic response to the flood. But the response to the flood, which says, we know why all these people died, it was just, they were drowned because indeed they sinned, is a different kind of response. So the second danger is that we're not selective, and it's very important. So I applaud what you're doing, which is to rescue the literature of the past and to find what we call the poetic truths. But we better make sure that in that story there is a poetic truth worth rescuing.
Okay, there are now quite a number of people who want to say something, so I think we have achieved what we wanted by this exchange of opinion. Steve Zipperstam, please.
Well, first I'd like to say something in defense of Yaakov's argument for the value of fiction. Do you remember that marvelous exchange in Bernard Malamud's The Assistant, where the assistant shopkeeper is walking home from the library with the daughter of the owner of the shop. She's carrying a book, and he asks, "What's that book?" And she says, "The Idiot." He says, "What is it?" She says, "It's a novel." He says, "I prefer the truth." She says, "It is the truth." It's a wonderful, wise exchange, and I think much in keeping with Yaakov's comments. There was something else that Yaakov said that struck me as also very, very true, and I want to raise this and see whether, in fact, my understanding of what he said is consistent with his. He said, as half a joke, but I think he was serious, that in his family they've passed on this tradition of atheism as a belief, as a faith. He used the word faith and belief, I think quite appropriately. It seems to me that to believe as those of us who see ourselves as liberals or on the left, to believe as we do in Enlightenment terms in the perfectibility and decency of the human being in the wake of Auschwitz is an act of faith. So doesn't this, consistent with what you said in that comment, in some way undermine stark juxtapositions between the irrationality of those who believe in religion, and the ostensible rationality of those of us who don't. Don't all of us believe? Don't all of us believe things that are irrational? I can't prove the perfectibility of man. I can't prove the essential decency of the human being. And my God, there is plenty of empirical proof in this century to prove the opposite. But like you, I believe. You and I are both believers, as I see it.
I suggest that you answer at the end. Eric.
I think I wanted to respond to Rabbi Wein first. I don't know whether Mordecai Kaplan's name here is welcome or unwelcome, but I'll mention him anyway, because 50 years ago the Reconstructionist movement certainly did try to deal with some of these issues that you raise in a very constructive or reconstructive way. And as for the 10th plague, I mean, Kaplan wrote a new Haggadah, which we still use, and we don't mention the 10th. We don't mention any of the plagues, and we don't allow anyone to rejoice at the destruction of the Egyptians when we do our Seder. So, I mean, there is a strong 20th century tradition of dealing with this, I think, in a very humanistic and non-theistic way.
What you're saying is that certain stories are not rescuable. Certain stories ought to be discarded. And that's exactly what Kaplan did, and that's what you've done. I congratulate you.
Now I want to. I don't want to try to rescue the flood story, but I would suggest that the kind of poetic imagination that we use to deal with the other stories you can use with the child and the flood story. You don't take the creation of Adam literally. Why should you take the creation, the destruction of the world by a flood in any literal way? The idea is that evil prevailed and a second creation had to be done. I mean, it's not... The commonality of this myth is so pervasive worldwide. I mean, Gasta has shown that this story is one of the most popular ways of impressing upon children and primitive peoples all over the world.
Most people in the world believe that if something bad happens to them, it's because of their sins, and they feel very guilty. And that kind of a story reinforces it. Of course, most people in the world believe that. One of the things that we as secular humanistic Jews want to maintain is that indeed, if disaster happens in an unfair world, it isn't because God is punishing you, and you have to have the courage and the strength to confront it. That is not the message of the Noah story.
But you can certainly interpret the story if you want to.
Sorry?
I have a different, I want to try an alternative humanistic reading of the Noah story. It seems to me that some of the comments here have focused more on blaming God or asking more about the morality or immorality of God than what else might be involved in the story. And it seems to me it seems to me that what's bothering people is that God seems to punish evil rather than trying to reform people, wait for repentance, lead them to some kind of better way. So I want to take God out of the story completely. I'm not interested in that question. And it seems to me there is some kind of truth in this story. If we think, I mean, do we want to, I look at it this way. Isn't there a point at which human behavior on its own can become so evil and so widespread and rampant that it becomes self-destructive? That's the story to me without a theistic twist, or indeed without an argument about God occupying the entire thinking about the story. I think in our century that makes a lot of sense to me. That humans can be so evil and it can be so widespread that human behavior can become self-destructive at times. Isn't that part of what the flood is saying?
Martin. Martin.
Yeah.
Take the microphone.
Oh, two quickies. One, Steve Zipperstein's comment to Yaakov about faith Yeah, there's an old tradition, I think it was Bunker Hill, which was Breed's Hill. Trust in God, but keep your powder dry. Well, Yaakov is use the myths, but keep your disbelief. I mean, I think they're flip sides of the same approach, and I don't think that that's wrong. There's a certain utility in that. But I think, and I want to ask everybody else if they think we're on, I'm correct, I think we're on the same track we were this morning. We are, without mentioning it, talking about a usable past. And Ada this morning talked about feeling protective of the myths, with I think, a whiff of the charge of iconoclasm, which I would plead not guilty to. And I think Yaakov's exposition is exactly correct. It isn't iconoclasm that we are pursuing from a secular humanist point of view. It is the beauty of the literature, qua literature. And for me, maybe I'm in the minority, I'm in favor of a usable past. And this enriches our source materials. We can use this. We can derive ideas from it. I'm not sure I agree with Sherwin that they all have to have a moral outcome, but I think we're not iconoclasts. The tiger is not at the gate, and I think a lot of what we've been talking about is, when we go back to our roots, what is there in our roots, including now we've been talking about the Bible, that is usable, that brings lessons to us. And I think it includes the myth and the literature as much as whatever historicity it reposes in the text itself.
I'd like to make a comment,
Sure.
if I may. I think that there's a misunderstanding here, at least that's what I feel, of the central point in Yaakov Malkin's lecture. And that is that the question whether God was right or wrong is immaterial to an analysis of myth. And the usability or otherwise of a tradition is determined by whether we can use a story like the Noah story in a positive or negative way. If you want to use that myth in order to show what not to do, you are still using it in a traditional way. And I feel that there is a great value to that. Of course, you choose whatever positive myths you find in a positive way. You are under no obligation to use a myth that has a negative message in a positive way. But it is our myth. When Yaakov said that he comes from a traditional atheistic family, I'm sure he will agree with me that the God that his parents and grandparents did not believe in was the Jewish God. Which is proof, if proof is needed, for a continued Jewish tradition. And I think that when we deal with our mythologies, I think that is the attitude that we might take, and in that way maybe we are using it in the sense of a usable past. I think that what is meant here in the way we deal with it is to realize the tremendous potential these myths have. And these myths have had, and not only on the Jewish culture, but on what is called inaccurately Western or Northern civilization as such. And if you want to propagate within that culture the negative myth, in other words, this is the way we should not behave, then this, I think, would be a great sign of honoring these myths that we inherited.
let me just, we have to conclude.
I'm going to
all right, Yaakov, and then fine.
No.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Conclude.
Please.
Let me intervene, Yaakov.
Well, I want to make an announcement anyway, so why don't you respond?
Okay.
Okay.
I agree 100% with Steve about belief and faith, that it's not always in rational things. For instance, our belief in values and the preference of humanization to dehumanization is a basis of all our ethical activity and all our ethical and humanistic orientation. And I'm not sure that I have the answer, the rational answer, why I do prefer humanization to dehumanization, except that in a world which will be dehumanized, we will not be able to exist. But when I spoke about faith, religious faith, I didn't mean faith in a God according to a religion, because I wanted to speak about the common denominator of all religions which believe in various gods. So obviously it's not the belief in a certain God. And even in Jewish religion, there is no way of forcing people to define what is their belief in God, even if they are religious. When I spoke about religion, the common denominator of all religions, only in one sense, that they believe in their duty to fulfill rules ruled by their religion, by the halakha, without a rational justification or without a value basis. And there is the difference, because I know that my atheistic faith in the human being as the creator of myth, the creator of ethics, the creator of God, is still includes many irrational things. But at least I do not take on any duties or any mitzvot that I do not have for them a rational explanation. Now, I agree also with Yuda about the use of myth sometimes in negative ways. In the secular literature that for the last 100 years, we can see things like the poems of Alterman, called the poems of Makat Bchorot, of Shirei Makot Mitzrayim, it is called, the poems of the Egyptian plague. And the whole poem, it's one of the most important, I think, achievements in poetry in modern literature, Hebrew literature. It is devoted to a compassion with the victims of this plague and not with the one who inflicted the plague.
But that's a modern poem.
It's a modern, that's what I mean. The approach to the myth can be sometimes in a completely negative way, but in a creative way, and as Yuda said, is part of integrating it in our history. And the same thing, of course, goes about the deluge, the flood, which those who will read carefully will see that it started because the sons of God fell from heaven on the daughters of men, and they, the sons of God, made them sinful. Kaplan, of course, is the way. I mean, is the basis of treating holidays and treating Judaism as a civilization, what he called, and I call it as a culture, only because the difference that Buber made between civilization and culture. But Kaplan, for instance, when he proposed to take out Kol Nidrei from Yom Kippur when he established his first synagogue, he failed in that because the committee of prayers decided to reintegrate it, is one of the typical things that we can do, taking out things from our tradition that really don't have any moral value or are antagonistic to our moral values, like, for instance, this terrible thing of Kol Nidrei, saying that everything I promised is nil and void, etc., and saying it in the height of the holidays. It's interesting that even in the Midrash, you have cases where they are treating in a critical and negative way myth. For instance, Ephraim Auerbach brings the Midrash where he says it is not true to accuse Adam, to accuse the first human being, that he invented death, because death was invented with the world. And therefore, it's not the sin of Adam who invented death. So, in other words, it's an accusation of God who accuses falsely the first human being. The discussion of myth is, in Judaism, the pluralistic way of continuing the tradition. And finally, I believe that what we can do with myth is, first of all, discern myth from reality, because this is a thing that we can do. And the second is to discern between myth and literature, to see how literature becomes myth, and also to go through the process of demythization and to see how myth can become again literature.
I would just like to conclude, because we want to break. I want to say that to Dr. Zipperstein, that one, I'm sorry that he can't adjust his belief system to fact. Meaning, I, by the way, grew up with certainly a belief in the perfectibility of human beings.
Sure, and I'm pleased that you end every session with me.
Yeah.
I mean,
let me finish. One of the things that I find interesting is, since the Holocaust, the last thing we can believe in is the fact that human beings are basically good. What we know from the Holocaust, indeed, is that we are a very mixed bag of emotions, and if you aim for the perfectibility of human beings, then you aim for an impossible goal. We aim to improve behavior, to improve human beings, and that is a possible goal within the realm of reality. So responding to all the evidence that you experience too, I never say that I believe in the perfect. At one time I did, but in the face of evidence, I have what? Changed my mind, and that is indeed the difference. To maintain a belief in the face of evidence is, in my mind, something not desirable. It's this kind of assertion against reality. And the second thing, the discussion we've had is very interesting to me, because Orthodox people never struggle to interpret myths. And the reason they don't struggle is because they don't regard them as such. And therefore they're very comfortable with them, because all those myths and all those stories fit their ideology, and they fit them and they support them in a very, very powerful way. We, on the other hand, having inherited that literature, we have to sit around struggling all the time, and we've ended up, it's rather interesting, with an almost act of desperation, which is that we can no longer use the myths positively. We are now going to use the myths negative. So I want to offer an alternative. And Yaakov brought it. That is, there has been written in Jewish literature over the last 300 years, magnificent poetry filled with poetic truth that gives expression exactly to what you're talking about, to all the ideas and feelings that we have. And I am not saying that we should not use the myths of the past, but part of our problem is we spend so much time trying to rescue the myths of the past, we are unable to deal with the poetic beauty. I mean, last year we honored him, Yehuda Amichai. If you want the poem of how to deal with an unfair and unjust world, you read Roshi Roshi, my head, my head. I did not cry Elohim, and I did not cry Imam Mama, do you understand? But I looked at the world, I said, Delet, Delet, there it is, door, door. And that is, in a sense, in that poetry, a poetic truth. And all I'm saying is, if we are driven to desperation trying to rescue old myths, let us not ignore all the wonderful and beautiful poetic creation of the Jewish people in modern times. Thank you. All right. And let me say, for those of you who would like to remain, it is now 4 o'clock. There will be would you just remain seated for a moment? From 4 to 5, there will be a discussion here for those people who would like to ask questions those of our speakers who will remain, and also it will be led by our faculty, by Marty Koch, Marty Koch, and by Renee Kogel. And so those of you who would like to be part of that discussion, please remain. Second, Shabbat dinner will begin at 6 o'clock, and here in the temple. And the Shabbat celebration in the evening will be at 8 o'clock, and it's going to be a grand celebration for us because we shall be graduating 12 of the future leaders or the present leaders